Welcome back, my sleepy friends. I know you guys are ready to sleep with some Greek mythology tonight, so let's snuggle up. Because the story you're about to hear isn't filled with battles or conquest. There are no monsters to slay, no kingdoms to overthrow. Instead, this is a tale of friendship, of teaching and learning, of how beauty can transform into something permanent when we least expect it. It's the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus, and how their companionship became immortalised in a flower that still blooms every spring, reminding us that some connections transcend even death itself. So if you are new to the channel or returning, liking the video and commenting significantly helps us out. Also, please let me know where you are listening in from and what time it is for you. Now get comfortable and let's start. Now before we meet the mortal boy who would change everything, you need to understand Apollo himself, not the simplified version you might remember from a high school mythology unit, the sun god with the lyre and the golden hair, but the more complete picture of who he actually was in the Greek imagination. Apollo lived on Mount Olympus, that mountain so tall it punched through clouds and existed partially in another realm entirely. His days were filled with responsibilities that would exhaust any modern CEO. Each morning, he drove the sun chariot across the sky, a task requiring absolute precision, because even a slight deviation in route could scorch the earth below or leave entire regions in darkness. Imagine being responsible for daylight itself, for the warmth that ripens grain and the light that guides ships safely to harbour. That was just Apollo's morning commute. The chariot itself was a marvel of divine engineering. Golden wheels that never needed oiling, reins woven from captured sunbeams, and horses with manes that flickered like flame. The 4 horses each had their own personality. Pirwa brought fire, Eos carried the dawn, Ethan contributed the blazing heat, and Phlegon added the burning light. Managing them required constant attention, because immortal horses don't tire the way mortal animals do, which means they're perpetually ready to bolt off course if their driver's concentration lapses even momentarily. But the sun chariot was merely one aspect of his domain. He was also the god of music, and his lyre could charm stones into dancing and make even Ares, the perpetually grumpy war god, tap his foot without realising it. Apollo had received this instrument from Hermes as a peace offering after the messenger god had stolen Apollo's cattle as an infant. A whole other story involving baby Hermes inventing the lyre from a tortoise shell and some cow sinew. The instrument produced sounds that weren't merely pleasant but had actual power. The ability to heal emotional wounds, to inspire creative breakthroughs, and to make even the most tone-deaf listener suddenly understand what music was truly for. Apollo presided over prophecy too, speaking through the oracle at Delphi in riddles that seemed incomprehensible, until events unfolded exactly as predicted. The temple at Delphi was his most famous shrine, where priestesses would breathe vapours rising from cracks in the earth and deliver pronouncements that shaped the course of wars, marriages, and political decisions across the Greek world. Kings and peasants alike made pilgrimages there, bringing offerings in hopes of glimpsing their futures. Apollo found this aspect of his responsibilities particularly draining, because mortal futures were often tragic, and knowing what was coming without being able to fully prevent it created its own special torture. He governed medicine and healing, which meant understanding the human body in ways that would make modern doctors envious. He knew which plants contained compounds that reduced fever, which techniques could set broken bones properly, how infections spread, and how to prevent them. This knowledge made him invaluable during plagues, though even divine healing had limits. He could cure individuals, but stopping epidemics required addressing their sources, which often involved changing human behaviour, something even gods found nearly impossible. Poetry fell under his domain as well, along with truth and rational thinking. He was the god people invoked when they wanted clarity, when they needed to think through complex problems, and when they sought elegant solutions rather than brute force approaches. Archery too belonged to him, not the hunting kind his sister Artemis practiced, but the precision shooting that required absolute control where every arrow hit exactly where intended, because the archer's mind and body worked in perfect synchronization. Basically, if it required skill, precision, or artistic talent, Apollo had a hand in it. His portfolio of responsibilities was so extensive that he sometimes felt stretched thin, pulled in a dozen directions simultaneously. Mortals prayed for healing, while others begged for prophetic guidance, while still others wanted help with their poetry, while the sun chariot needed driving, and the oracle required oversight, and musical competitions needed judging. It never stopped. You might think being a god would be all parties on Olympus and mortals bringing you offerings, but divinity came with its own peculiar loneliness. Apollo's siblings and fellow gods were, to put it mildly, a complicated bunch. His father, Zeus, couldn't stop causing scandals, constantly seducing mortal women and creating half-divine offspring who then caused all sorts of complications. The resulting family dynamics made holiday gatherings awkward at best, and explosive at worst. His twin sister Artemis preferred the wilderness and the company of her hunting companions. She'd sworn off romantic relationships entirely, devoting herself to the chase in the forest. Apollo loved his sister and respected her choices, but it meant she wasn't particularly available for casual conversation or emotional support. She had her own sphere of influence to manage, her own worshippers to attend to, and limited patience for Apollo's more social tendencies. Dionysus was usually off starting wine cults and causing chaos wherever he went. The god of wine and ecstasy wasn't particularly reliable for serious conversations, though admittedly his parties were legendary. Athena stayed buried in strategic planning, always 3 steps ahead in some complex game of divine chess that only she fully understood. She was brilliant but exhausting to be around, every conversation turning into a philosophical debate or tactical discussion. Aphrodite created more problems than she solved, her meddling in love affairs causing endless complications. She meant well, love was her domain after all, but her interventions often backfired spectacularly. And Hera was perpetually angry about Zeus's behaviour, which made family dinners awkward for everyone involved. Her rage at her husband's infidelities often spilled over onto innocent bystanders, and nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire. The other gods each had their quirks. Hephaestus stayed in his forge, creating magnificent weapons and jewellery but rarely socialising. Hermes was friendly but always rushing off to deliver messages. Demeter obsessed over agriculture and her daughter Persephone's annual descent to the underworld. Poseidon sulked in his ocean palace, still bitter about losing the contest for Athens to Athena centuries earlier. Hades rarely left the underworld, and honestly, nobody blamed him. Managing the dead seemed like a depressing job even by divine standards. Apollo had lovers, certainly. Gods and mortals both fell for his golden beauty and divine charisma. His appearance was striking, perpetually youthful, with hair that caught sunlight even indoors, and features that sculptors spent careers trying to adequately capture in marble. His presence carried warmth, literally and figuratively, as if he brought his solar associations with him wherever he went. But these relationships had a tendency to end badly. There was Daphne, who literally turned into a tree to escape his pursuit, not exactly a confidence booster. He'd been struck by one of Eros's arrows, filled with irresistible desire for the river nymph, while she'd been hit with an arrow of aversion. The resulting chase ended with her begging her father, the river god Peneus, to save her, and he transformed her into a laurel tree. Apollo, heartbroken, declared the laurel sacred to him, wearing crowns woven from its leaves as a permanent reminder of what he'd lost. Cassandra had accepted his romantic attention initially, and he'd given her the gift of prophecy as a love offering. But when she later rejected him, he couldn't take back the prophetic ability. Divine gifts don't work that way. So in spite, he cursed her prophecies to never be believed. She spent the rest of her life knowing exactly what disasters were coming, warning everyone around her, and being dismissed as crazy. Apollo wasn't proud of that particular response. The divine emotions operate at intensities that make grudge-holding particularly destructive. Coronis had cheated on him while pregnant with his child, choosing a mortal man over a god. When a white crow, one of Apollo's sacred birds, brought him the news, Apollo's rage was instantaneous. He killed Coronis, though he saved the unborn baby, who became Asclepius, the god of medicine. The crow, which had been pure white, was turned black as punishment for bearing bad news, which is why crows have dark feathers to this day. It was another relationship that ended in death and transformation, another reminder that Apollo's love seemed to carry a curse. The pattern repeated itself with dispiriting regularity, attraction, brief connection, disaster. Apollo began to wonder if something about his divine nature made healthy relationships impossible. Perhaps the power imbalance was too great. Mortals couldn't truly say no to a god, which meant consent became muddy. Perhaps immortality was the problem. How could beings with endless time truly connect with those whose lives flickered past in what felt like heartbeats? What Apollo craved, though he might not have articulated it even to himself, was something simpler than romance. He wanted companionship without the weight of divine politics. He wanted someone to share his knowledge with, to teach without the formality of the temple setting where worshippers bowed and scraped and never just talked to him like a person. He wanted, in essence, a friend. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a god who could literally control the sun's path across the heavens, who could see fragments of the future, who could create music that made the very cosmos pause to listen, and yet he felt something missing. It's a peculiar kind of emptiness, having everything except the one thing you actually need. The loneliness had been building for centuries. Gods don't experience time the way mortals do. Years blur together when you have infinitely more coming. But even Apollo could feel the weight of isolation accumulating. He'd attended countless festivals in his honour, received millions of prayers, and judged hundreds of musical competitions. But none of it filled the hollow space that came from never having anyone to simply be with. No performance or divine dignity required. On Olympus, Apollo would sometimes stand at the edge of the cloudy precipice and look down at the mortal world below. He'd watch humans going about their brief, urgent lives, farming, building, arguing, laughing, aging. Their existence seemed simultaneously fragile and enviable. They didn't have eternal life, but they also didn't carry the burden of forever. They formed connections without calculating divine consequences. They could be surprised, could change, or could be changed by others. From his elevated vantage point, Apollo saw the entire Mediterranean spread below him like a map. He watched ships crossing the wine-dark sea, their sails catching wind as sailors sang work songs to keep rhythm. He observed farmers tending olive groves, the silver-green leaves shimmering in the afternoon heat. He saw shepherds guiding flocks through mountain passes, children playing in village squares, and merchants arguing over prices in crowded agoras. One day, his gaze fell upon Sparta, that military city-state known for producing warriors as reliably as other regions produced olives. Sparta occupied a valley in the southeastern Peloponnese, surrounded by mountains that provided natural defence. The city itself was notably lacking in grand architecture. Spartans believed in austerity, investing resources in military training rather than decorative temples or theatres. Their values were brutally simple: strength, discipline, obedience, and courage. But Sparta wasn't just soldiers and shields. It also valued beauty, athletic excellence, and education. Or at least their particular interpretation of education, which involved a lot more wrestling and a lot less poetry than Apollo might have preferred. The Spartans believed physical perfection reflected internal excellence, that training the body disciplined the mind, and that athletic competition prepared young men for warfare while also honouring the gods. And there, training in the gymnasium was a boy who caught Apollo's divine attention like sunlight catching on bronze. The gymnasium was an open-air facility common across Greece, where young men trained naked. The word gymnasium literally derives from gymnos, meaning naked. This wasn't considered sexual or inappropriate, but practical and egalitarian. Everyone trained in the same state. No expensive clothing to mark class distinctions. and nothing to hide poor form or inadequate conditioning. Olive oil was applied to the skin before exercise, both for cleansing purposes and to make the muscles' movements more visible, easier to critique, and improved. Apollo watched this particular training session with growing interest. Most of the young Spartans were competent and well drilled in their techniques, but one stood out. Not because he was the strongest or fastest, though he was clearly athletic, but because of something harder to define. A quality of movement, perhaps, or an expression of focused concentration that suggested intelligence guiding the physical effort. This was Hyacinthus, though Apollo didn't know his name yet. And even from Olympus, even from that divine distance, Apollo recognized something special. Hyacinthus. Thus wasn't what you'd expect for someone about to attract the attention of a god. He wasn't a prince with a tragic destiny mapped out by the fates, and wasn't a hero destined for legendary deeds that bards would sing about for centuries. He was simply a Spartan youth, probably around 16 or 17 years old, with the kind of beauty that made even pragmatic Spartans stop and stare. You need to understand what beauty meant to the ancient Greeks, because it wasn't quite what we mean by the word today. It wasn't just about physical appearance, though Hyacinthus certainly had that. Dark curls that caught the light like polished bronze, strong limbs developed through constant athletic training since childhood, and a face that sculptors would study for hours, trying to capture its particular balance of strength and gentleness. His features held that quality the Greeks called symmetry, not meaning identical sides, but rather proportions that pleased the eye and that suggested harmony and balance. But Greek beauty, the word they used was kalos, encompassed more than surface appeal. It suggested excellence in action, virtue in character, and the kind of grace that comes from a body and mind working in perfect synchronization. Beauty was moral as much as physical, an outward manifestation of internal excellence. When Greeks praised someone as beautiful, they were making a statement about that person's entire being, not just their appearance. Hyacinthus possessed this quality. When he threw the discus, his form was technically perfect, feet positioned precisely, torso rotating at the optimal angle, and arm extending in a smooth arc that wasted no energy on unnecessary movement. Modern coaches would film it and use it as instructional material, breaking down each element of his technique to show students what perfect execution looked like. When he ran, his stride had an efficiency that covered maximum distance with minimum effort. His breathing synchronized with his footfalls in that rhythm experienced runners know but can never quite teach to beginners. When he wrestled, a crucial part of Spartan training, he combined strength with strategy in ways that defeated larger opponents. Wrestling wasn't just about overpowering your opponent, but about reading their movements, anticipating their next grip, and using their own momentum against them. Hyacinthus excelled at this mental aspect, turning wrestling matches into chess games played with bodies instead of pieces. But beyond the athletics, there was something else that made Hyacinthus unusual in Sparta's military culture. A curiosity, an openness to learning, and a genuine kindness that hadn't been beaten out of him by the notoriously harsh training regimens. Sparta's educational system, the agog, was designed to produce obedient warriors, not philosophers. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 and subjected to brutal conditioning. Minimal food to teach them to steal without getting caught. Public beatings to build pain tolerance, and constant competition to establish hierarchies. Somehow, Hyacinthus had survived this system without losing his gentler qualities. He helped younger trainees with their techniques rather than bullying them the way older boys were expected to. When he noticed mistakes, he corrected them with patient explanations rather than mockery. During meals, those meagre portions that were never quite enough, he'd sometimes share bits of his food with boys who looked particularly hungry, an act of compassion that was technically discouraged but hard to punish when done discreetly. Apollo watched him for days before making his approach. This wasn't the typical divine infatuation where a god spots an attractive mortal and immediately descends in some dramatic fashion. Thunder booming, light blazing, mortals falling to their knees in awe. Apollo had learned from his previous relationship disasters that dramatic approaches rarely led to genuine connections. Instead, he took his time, observing not just Hyacinthus's physical skills but also his character, his interactions, and the small moments when people reveal who they really are. He saw how Hyacinthus responded when he won competitions, with grace rather than gloating, offering genuine compliments to his defeated opponents, rather than rubbing his victories in their faces. He noticed how the boy would sometimes pause during his runs to look at the surrounding landscape, at the mountains rising in the distance, and at the way light fell through olive trees, as if beauty itself drew his attention the way strategy might captivate other Spartans. During one observation session, Apollo watched Hyacinthus stop to help an elderly man who'd stumbled while carrying a heavy load. This simple act of kindness, unobserved by anyone except a god watching from Olympus, told Apollo more about the boy's character than any athletic achievement could. Sparta's values emphasized strength and military prowess, often at the expense of compassion. Seeing Hyacinthus choose kindness when there was no social benefit to doing so suggested a moral core that had survived his harsh upbringing intact. Apollo also noticed how Hyacinthus interacted with animals. Stray dogs followed him hopefully, sensing his gentle nature. Horses calmed under his touch, even spirited ones that gave other handlers trouble. Birds seemed less wary when he was near, as if they recognized he posed no threat. This affinity with animals often indicated a person who possessed empathy and patience, qualities Apollo found himself increasingly drawn to. When Apollo finally decided to introduce himself, he didn't arrive with thunderbolts or divine fanfare. He simply appeared at the gymnasium one afternoon in mortal form, looking like a young man perhaps a few years older than Hyacinthus, dressed in simple training clothes that wouldn't attract particular attention. He'd made himself attractive, but not impossibly so, the kind of looks that drew appreciative glances without making people suspicious about divine involvement. In Greek culture, particularly in Sparta, it wasn't unusual for older men to befriend and mentor younger ones. These relationships, called pederasty, though the term had different connotations than its modern usage, were considered important for education and social development. An older male would guide a younger one through the transition to adulthood, teaching practical skills, social expectations, and cultural values. The relationship sometimes included romantic or sexual elements, though this varied significantly based on region, individuals, and circumstances. In Sparta, these bonds were seen as strengthening military cohesion. Men who loved each other fought more fiercely to protect one another, so Apollo's approach wouldn't have seemed strange to anyone watching. An older youth offering coaching to a promising younger athlete was perfectly normal, even expected. Apollo waited until Hyacinthus thus completed a series of discus throws, watching the boy's technique with genuine interest rather than divine condescension. When the last throw landed, a good distance but with slight rotation issues that reduced effectiveness, Apollo approached casually as if they were already acquainted. "Your discus technique is excellent," Apollo said, his voice carrying the warmth of a genuine compliment rather than empty flattery. "But you're rotating your shoulders too early. If you wait just a fraction longer, feel the weight shift completely to your back foot first. You'll get significantly more distance." Hyacinthus thus turned, surprised. He'd been training alone and hadn't noticed this stranger watching. In Sparta, unsolicited coaching could be taken as an insult, suggesting the recipient wasn't already perfect, or that the speaker presumed authority they hadn't earned. Many young Spartans would have responded with defensive hostility, viewing the comment as a challenge to their competence. But Hyacinthus just examined Apollo with curious interest, taking a moment to assess this stranger who spoke with such confidence. He saw someone athletic and poised, someone whose own body suggested extensive training, whose stance indicated comfort with physical activity. And there was something in the stranger's eyes, a warmth, a genuine interest, that diffused any potential offence. "Show me," Hyacinthus asked, holding out the discus. It was a test in a way. If this stranger was all talk, the offer would expose him as someone who critiqued better than he performed. But if he could actually do what he claimed, then his advice was worth considering. Apollo took the bronze disc, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. Discus throwing went back to the earliest Greek games, a test of strength, technique and precision. The implement itself was deceptively simple, a flat circular weight with slightly raised edges for grip, but mastering its use required years of practice. You had to feel the weight, understand its flight characteristics, and know exactly when to release for maximum distance and accuracy. He didn't cheat using divine power, where would be the fun in that? But his countless years of experience guided the throw. Apollo had been throwing discuses since before most Greek cities existed, had taught the sport to heroes and kings, and had judged competitions across the Mediterranean. His muscle memory went deeper than any mortal's could. His understanding of physics and trajectories more complete. The discus left his hand at the perfect moment, spinning with ideal rotation, following an arc so clean it looked like a mathematical diagram come to life. It flew substantially farther than Hyacinthus's best attempt, landing with a solid thud that kicked up dust where it struck. Several other athletes had stopped their own training to watch, recognizing an exceptional throw when they saw one. There was a moment of appreciative silence, the kind athletic communities give to excellence, before normal gymnasium noise resumed. Hyacinthus's response told Apollo everything he needed to know about the boy's character. Instead of sulking or making excuses about how he wasn't properly warmed up, about how his earlier throws had already tired his arms, or about how the stranger must have gotten lucky, all the responses Apollo had seen from other young athletes confronted with superior performance, Hyacinthus grinned with genuine delight. "That was incredible," he said, his admiration unfeigned. "Can you teach me that? Please? I've been trying to increase my distance for months but plateaued." The request was direct, humble and enthusiastic. Everything Apollo hoped for. Here was someone more interested in learning than protecting his ego, more excited by excellence than threatened by it. This was exactly the kind of student Apollo had been hoping to find. "I can teach you," Apollo agreed, matching Hyacinthus's smile with his own. "But it'll take time. Good technique develops gradually, not overnight." "I have time," Hyacinthus assured him. "I'm Hyacinthus, by the way, in case you want to know who you're coaching." "Apollo," the god replied, using his real name because why not? Mortals rarely believed they were actually meeting gods, even when those gods introduced themselves honestly. They assumed it was just a name, a coincidence that someone happened to share the sun god's title. "Like the god?" Hyacinthus asked, amused. "Exactly like the god," Apollo confirmed, his smile widening at the irony. Hyacinthus laughed, taking it as a joke. "Well then, divine Apollo, please share your celestial wisdom about discus throwing with this humble mortal." And just like that, a friendship began. Over the following weeks, Apollo and Hyacinthus became inseparable. To the other Spartans, it appeared to be a typical mentorship, an older youth teaching a younger one the finer points of athletics and philosophy. No one questioned it, because such relationships were woven into the fabric of Greek society, particularly in Sparta, where male bonds were considered crucial to military cohesion and social stability. But this connection was different from those formal mentorships. Apollo, despite his divine nature, or perhaps because of it, found himself genuinely enjoying Hyacinthus's company in ways he hadn't anticipated. The boy asked questions constantly, his mind as agile as his body, never satisfied with surface explanations but always pushing deeper, wanting to understand the underlying principles, the why behind the what. They spent their mornings in athletic training at the gymnasium, arriving early when dew still clung to grass and the air held night's coolness before the sun burned it away. Apollo would demonstrate discus throws, breaking down each element of the motion, the stance, the weight shift, the rotation, the release point, explaining not just what to do but why it worked. Hyacinthus would practice each component separately, drilling the movements until muscle memory developed, until his body could execute them without conscious thought. "Feel the weight here," Apollo would say, positioning Hyacinthus's feet. Your power comes from the ground up, not from your arms. The throw is really just directing energy that starts in your legs. Hyacinthus would nod, focusing with that intense concentration he brought to learning. He'd practice the stance, shifting his weight, feeling how the position of his feet changed which muscles engaged. Then he'd add the rotation, keeping his core tight, learning to transfer momentum smoothly from lower body to upper. Finally, the release, that crucial moment when everything came together, when technique translated into flight. His throws improved steadily, distance increasing week by week as his form refined. Apollo watched with genuine pride, the kind a teacher feels when a student's success reflects not just talent, but dedicated effort. Hyacinthus never complained about repetition, never grew impatient with gradual progress. He understood that excellence required patience, that shortcuts led to sloppy technique that would have to be unlearned later. They worked on javelin throwing too, Apollo teaching the grip that maximised distance without sacrificing accuracy. The javelin required different skills than the discus, more about speed and aim, less about rotational power. Hyacinthus thus took to it naturally, his strong shoulders and quick reflexes serving him well. Apollo showed him how to gauge wind direction, how to adjust his angle of release for different distances, and how to follow through properly to avoid shoulder strain. Wrestling occupied afternoons when the day's heat made running uncomfortable, but physical activity was still possible. Greek wrestling was sophisticated, with complex rules about holds, throws, and victory conditions. You won by throwing your opponent to the ground 3 times, or by forcing them out of the designated area, or by getting them to submit. Striking was forbidden. This wasn't boxing, so the art focused on leverage, balance, and technique, rather than raw power. Apollo had wrestled for millennia and knew every trick and counter move that existed. But he didn't simply overpower Hyacinthus with superior skill. Instead, he taught incrementally, introducing new techniques one at a time, giving the boy opportunities to practice them in actual matches. He deliberately set up situations where a specific move would be effective, then congratulate Hyacinthus when he successfully applied the technique. There, that hip throw, perfect execution, Apollo would praise after Hyacinthus successfully demonstrated a move they'd been drilling. Feel how you use my momentum against me. That's the key. Force is your opponent's problem to manage, not yours to create. Between training sessions, they'd rest in whatever shade they could find, under olive trees or the gymnasium's portico, and talk. Hyacinthus wanted to know everything. Why the sky changed colours at sunset, how music could evoke specific emotions, what made some poems memorable while others faded, why the human body could perform certain feats and not others. Apollo found himself explaining concepts he'd taken for granted for millennia. He described how light worked, painting word pictures of rays travelling from the sun to earth, how different angles created different colours, and why twilight lasted longer than dawn. He taught Hyacinthus about astronomy, pointing out constellations visible in daylight if you knew exactly where to look, explaining how sailors used them for navigation, and how the stars' positions changed with seasons. That bright point just visible near the horizon, Apollo indicated with his finger. That's Aphrodite's star. Mortals call it the morning star or evening star depending on when they see it, not realising it's the same object. It's actually a world like Earth, closer to the sun, covered in clouds so thick you'd never see the surface. Hyacinthus squinted in the direction Apollo pointed, trying to spot the faint glimmer. How do you know what the surface looks like if the clouds are that thick? Because I've been close enough to feel the heat radiating from it, Apollo said, which was technically true. His sun chariot passed near Venus regularly. Trust me, you wouldn't want to visit. Hot enough to melt bronze. He shared medical knowledge too, showing which plants healed which ailments, how to set a broken bone so it would mend straight, and why fever sometimes helped the body fight illness rather than just causing suffering. Hyacinthus absorbed it all with hungry interest, occasionally running to gather plant samples Apollo mentioned, wanting to see and touch the leaves, to smell them, and to understand how you'd identify them in the wild. This one, careful, the leaves can irritate skin if you're sensitive, but if you brew it as tea, it reduces fever and pain, Apollo explained, holding up a plant with small white flowers. Especially useful for headaches or muscle soreness after training. How much do you use? How long does it brew? Hyacinthus wanted specifics, practical knowledge he could apply. Depends on the severity. For mild pain, a small handful of flowers is steeped until the water cools. For severe pain, more flowers, hotter water, and longer steeping. But don't overdo it. Too much can upset your stomach, and then you've traded one problem for another. But the teaching flowed both ways. Hyacinthus taught Apollo about the mortal experience in ways no amount of divine observation could capture. He explained how it felt to improve at a skill, the satisfaction of mastering something that had previously defeated you. He described the urgency of mortal time, how knowing your days were limited made each sunset more vivid, and each achievement more meaningful because it might be your last opportunity to excel. When you have forever, does anything feel important? Hyacinthus asked one evening, unknowingly striking at one of Apollo's core struggles. I mean, if there's always tomorrow, why would today matter? Apollo considered this carefully. Everything matters and nothing does simultaneously. I can't explain it well. Important events pile up until they blur together. But at the same time, because I remember everything clearly, each moment exists forever in my memory, which makes it permanent in a way you don't experience. That sounds lonely, Hyacinthus observed quietly. Remembering everything, never forgetting, never able to just let things go and move forward. The boy's insight surprised Apollo. It is lonely, he admitted, which is part of why I'm enjoying this so much. You make everything feel fresh again, seeing you discover things I've known forever. It's like experiencing them for the first time through your reactions. Afternoons were for music and poetry when physical training would be counterproductive, when muscles needed rest but mind stayed active. Apollo brought his lyre, not the full-power divine instrument, but a beautiful mortal version he'd commissioned from the best craftsman in Athens. Its frame was tortoiseshell, its strings gut, and its pegs carved from ivory. When played properly, it produced sounds that made listeners stop whatever they were doing and just listen. Apollo taught Hyacinthus basic playing techniques, showing him how to hold the instrument, how to pluck strings cleanly without accidentally muting adjacent ones, and how different hand positions created different tones. Hyacinthus proved to be a decent student, though he readily admitted music wasn't his strongest skill. "My fingers feel too thick for these strings," he'd say, laughing at his own clumsiness when he struck wrong notes. "I think I'm more suited to throwing things than playing things. That's just unfamiliarity," Apollo would assure him. "Your fingers are exactly right. You just need practice. Musicians develop calluses and muscle memory the same way athletes do. Give it time." They'd compose silly songs together, competing to see who could rhyme the most ridiculous words or create the most absurd metaphors. Hyacinthus would deliberately craft terrible verses, mangling meter and sense until both of them were laughing too hard to continue. These moments delighted Apollo more than any perfectly performed hymn in his honour. For once, excellence didn't matter. Joy was the only goal. The warrior bold, his toes so cold, fought enemies with toenails of gold. So Hyacinthus would sing in exaggerated melodramatic style, making up nonsense as he went. Apollo would counter with equally ridiculous verses. The maiden fair with lovely hair once kissed a turnip on a dare. They'd continue until the entire song devolved into incomprehensible gibberish, and both of them collapsed with laughter, other athletes looking over with bemused expressions, wondering what their city's most promising young warrior was doing, giggling about turnips with his eccentric mentor. Apollo taught him about poetry too, the serious kind, explaining how ancient bards had used strict meters to memorize impossibly long epic poems before writing became common. He recited passages from the Iliad and Odyssey, which were relatively recent compositions at this point, showing how the repeated phrases wine-dark sea, rosy-fingered dawn, swift-footed Achilles weren't just poetic, but mnemonic devices helping bards remember thousands of lines. So when they say swift-footed Achilles every time, Hyacinthus, thus worked through the logic, it's not just a description but also a memory aid. The same phrase always follows Achilles, so you know what comes next. Exactly. And the meter helps too. Greek poetry follows rhythmic patterns that are easier to remember than random speech. Your mind anticipates the rhythm, which helps recall the words. Apollo demonstrated by reciting a passage with exaggerated emphasis on the rhythmic beats. Hyacinthus tried memorizing sections himself, stumbling over unfamiliar words but gradually building fluency. Apollo would correct his pronunciation gently, explaining how certain syllables were stressed in proper Greek, how line breaks affected meaning, and how good poetry operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Surface story, deeper themes, and linguistic musicality all working together. Evenings found them talking, just talking, about everything and nothing. They'd sit on a hillside overlooking Sparta as stars emerged in the darkening sky. The city would be settling into night. Cooking fires producing thin columns of smoke, voices carrying across the quiet valley, and dogs barking in the distance. This was Apollo's favourite time of day, when his solar duties were complete but night's responsibilities hadn't yet begun. Apollo would point out planets and stars, though he had to be careful not to reveal too much divine knowledge. "That's Aphrodite's star, the bright one low on the horizon," he'd say. Or, "That constellation is the great hunter Orion, though between you and me, his reputation exceeds his actual accomplishments. Artemis tells stories about his terrible hunting form." "You're making that up," Hyacinthus would accuse, grinning. "Maybe," Apollo would admit, "but it could be true." They'd discuss philosophy too, though neither called it that. Questions about virtue and excellence, about what made a life meaningful, and about whether it was better to be remembered for greatness or forgotten but happy. These were the kinds of conversations Spartans didn't typically engage in. Their culture valued action over contemplation, military achievement over philosophical inquiry. Do you think it's better to live shorter but accomplish more, or longer but never do anything particularly notable? Hyacinthus asked one evening. Apollo thought about his own immortal existence. "I don't think the length matters as much as the quality. A short life filled with meaning and connection is better than an endless one that's empty. Though obviously, a long meaningful life would be ideal. But you'd get more meaning in total if you lived longer," Hyacinthus reasoned. "So shouldn't length matter?" "Only if meaning accumulates," Apollo countered. "Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you only get so much meaningful experience regardless of how long you live, and the rest is just repetition." Hyacinthus talked about his family. His father was a Spartan of modest rank, nothing particularly distinguished, and his mother had died when he was young. He had siblings but wasn't especially close to them. Spartan society deliberately weakened family bonds to strengthen loyalty to the state, and that conditioning had worked to some degree. He spoke about his training, the brutal years of the agoge that had shaped him, and the teachers who'd beaten him and praised him, and pushed him toward excellence. He talked about his dreams too, his hopes of becoming someone memorable, though he wasn't quite sure how to achieve that. "Sparta produces warriors," he'd say, his voice thoughtful. "But I don't think I want to be remembered for killing people. There has to be something else, doesn't there? Some other way to matter? Some way to contribute that doesn't involve taking lives?" These conversations touched something deep in Apollo. Here was someone who wanted to create rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. In militaristic Sparta, such attitudes weren't exactly encouraged. The city's entire purpose was producing soldiers, and everything else was secondary. But Hyacinthus held these values nonetheless, privately questioning whether Sparta's single-minded focus on warfare represented the best or only path to excellence. "You could be a teacher," Apollo suggested. "Pass on your knowledge to the next generation. Help others achieve their potential." Maybe Hyacinthus considered this. Though teachers aren't exactly celebrated in Sparta the way warriors are. Nobody builds monuments to coaches. "They should," Apollo said firmly. A good teacher shapes dozens or hundreds of lives. That's more impact than most warriors have, even famous ones. As seasons shifted from late summer into early autumn, their friendship deepened into something both of them treasured above almost anything else. Apollo found himself looking forward to their time together with an anticipation he hadn't felt in centuries. The administrative duties of godhood, the prayers to answer, the prophecies to deliver, the sun chariot to drive, the oracle to oversee, the plagues to address, became things he had to do before he could return to what he wanted to do: spend time with his friend. He began rushing through his solar duties, driving the chariot faster than strictly necessary, taking shortcuts that saved a few minutes. He delegated more responsibilities to subordinate deities and trusted priests. He simplified prophecies, giving straightforward answers when he might previously have crafted elaborate riddles. Also, he could maximize the time available for training and talking with Hyacinthus. The other Olympians noticed Apollo's changed behaviour but didn't comment directly. Artemis gave him knowing looks but said nothing. Hermes made a few jokes about Apollo being particularly cheerful lately, unusually eager to finish his work. Athena observed the situation with her characteristic analytical detachment, but kept her conclusions private. Hyacinthus, for his part, knew his companion was special, though he didn't realise quite how special. There was something uncanny about the older youth, the way he seemed to know things he shouldn't, like historical events he claimed to have witnessed, or medical knowledge that was supposed to be restricted to priests. The occasional slip when he'd mentioned events from centuries past as if he'd been personally present. The way animals seemed unusually calm in his presence, birds landing nearby as if wanting to be close to him. The fact that he never got sunburned no matter how long they trained in direct light, while everyone else needed shade and oil for protection. But Hyacinthus didn't pry. Whatever secrets his friend held, they didn't diminish the genuine connection between them. If Apollo wanted to tell him the truth, he would. If not, Hyacinthus was content to accept the mystery as part of who his friend was. Other Spartans noticed the friendship, of course. Some felt envious of Hyacinthus's fortune in finding such an excellent mentor, someone who combined athletic skill with intellectual depth, which was rare in militaristic Sparta. Others felt suspicious of the stranger who'd appeared from nowhere and claimed so much of their promising young athlete's time. Where did he come from? What city did he represent? Why wasn't he training for warfare the way young men should? But no one interfered. In a culture that valued such mentorships as crucial for social development and military cohesion, there was no cause for complaint. Apollo was clearly teaching Hyacinthus valuable skills. The boy's athletic performance had improved noticeably. His discus throws travelled farther, his javelin throws flew straighter, and his wrestling technique had become sophisticated enough to defeat older, stronger opponents. The two of them established routines and private jokes, the kind of shared language that develops between people who spend substantial time together. If Apollo adjusted his chiton a certain way, Hyacinthus knew they were about to do something physically demanding and he should stretch thoroughly. When Hyacinthus tilted his head at a particular angle while listening, Apollo recognized it as a sign the boy was working through a complex idea and needed patient silence rather than additional explanation. They could communicate with glances across the gymnasium, entire conversations happening in raised eyebrows and subtle smiles. When other athletes were being particularly obtuse or pompous, Apollo would catch Hyacinthus's eye, and they'd share a moment of silent amusement. When Hyacinthus struggled with a technique and felt frustrated, Apollo's small nod conveyed confidence and encouragement without words. For Apollo, this period was something close to mortal happiness. He still had his divine responsibilities, but they no longer consumed his entire existence. He had someone to share observations with, to teach without the formal distance of worshippers at a temple who prostrated themselves and spoke in reverential tones. He had a friend who made him laugh, who challenged his ideas in respectful ways, and who saw him as a person rather than an icon to be feared or placated. For Hyacinthus, the friendship provided intellectual stimulation that Sparta's military culture couldn't offer. He loved his city and respected its values, Discipline, courage, loyalty, physical excellence. But he'd always felt slightly out of place, too interested in questions that didn't have practical military applications, too fascinated by beauty and ideas for a society that valued functionality above aesthetics. With Apollo, he could explore those questions freely. He could wonder aloud about the nature of beauty or the purpose of existence, without being dismissed as too philosophical for a warrior. He could admit uncertainty without being labelled weak. He could be curious without being mocked for not already knowing everything. Neither of them thought about endings. Gods don't typically worry about mortality. They're too far removed from it to really grasp its urgency. And young people rarely contemplate their own finite nature, convinced at some level that they're immortal, that death is something that happens to other people, older people, unlucky people, but never to them. They existed fully in their present moments, collecting memories neither of them consciously recognised they were collecting. The warm afternoons, the shared meals of bread and cheese and olives, the quiet conversations under stars, the laughter when one of them said something ridiculous, the companionable silences that needed no filling. All of it felt permanent in the way good things always feel permanent while you're experiencing them. The future seemed to stretch out endlessly, full of more training sessions and philosophical discussions and silly songs. There would always be tomorrow to continue their work, always next week to tackle new topics, always next season to refine techniques and deepen understanding, or so they both assumed, with the comfortable certainty of those who haven't yet learned that the universe doesn't honour assumptions, that tomorrow is never guaranteed, and that the threads the fates spin can be cut without warning or fairness. Autumn in ancient Greece was harvest season, when the work of summer came to fruition, and communities celebrated the year's bounty with festivals and feasts. The air carried that particular crispness that makes every breath feel cleansing, and the light took on a golden quality that made ordinary landscapes look touched by divine favour, which technically they were whenever Apollo was nearby, his solar nature colouring everything around him with warmth and radiance. On one particularly beautiful afternoon, Apollo and Hyacinthus decided to practice discus throwing in a field outside the city. The location was perfect for their purposes, flat and open with soft grass that would cushion any missed catches, but far enough from Sparta proper that they could practice without constant interruption from other athletes wanting to join them, or spectators commenting on their technique. They'd chosen this spot before and valued its privacy and its distance from the crowded gymnasium, where dozens of young men trained simultaneously in limited space. Here, they could talk freely while training, could take breaks whenever they wanted without feeling judged for resting, and could experiment with new techniques without worrying about looking foolish if the experiments failed. The field stretched out in all directions, bordered by olive groves that provided afternoon shade and occasional privacy. Wildflowers dotted the grass, small purple and yellow blooms that would become invisible in a few weeks, when autumn deepened toward winter. The air smelled of dried grass and distant wood smoke from cooking fires in farmhouses scattered across the valley. The session started like many others. Apollo demonstrated techniques while Hyacinthus watched carefully, his eyes tracking every detail of stance and motion, and then attempted to replicate them. The boy's form had improved dramatically over their months together. Anyone watching would recognise a skilled athlete who'd received excellent coaching. His rotation timing had gotten better, smoother and more controlled. His release had become cleaner, the discus leaving his hand at the optimal moment without hesitation or adjustment. His follow-through was more complete, his body finishing each throw in a balanced position, rather than stumbling or over-rotating the way beginners did. Apollo felt genuine pride watching the discus arc through the autumn air, flying farther than Hyacinthus's previous attempts. "Excellent," he called out after one particularly good throw. "You're almost ready to compete in the games. Another few months of practice and you'll be placing highly, maybe even winning." Hyacinthus retrieved the discus, grinning with that particular satisfaction athletes feel when hard work visibly pays off. "Almost ready?" he challenged, though his tone was playful rather than offended. "Are you suggesting I'm not already perfect? "I'm suggesting you're remarkably close to perfect," Apollo corrected, matching his student's playful tone. "Which, coming from me, is a significant compliment. I don't praise lightly." "Your humility is truly inspiring," Hyacinthus teased, walking back with the bronze disc balanced on one hand. "Tell me, do all gods have such modest opinions of themselves? Or are you special?" "Oh, I'm definitely special," Apollo confirmed with exaggerated seriousness. "The other gods are absolutely unbearable in their arrogance. I, on the other hand, am perfectly humble about my many exceptional qualities." They both laughed, falling back into that easy rapport they developed, where teasing carried affection rather than criticism, and where mock arrogance highlighted the absurdity of actual arrogance. They traded the discus back and forth, falling into that comfortable rhythm athletes know well, the zen of repetitive motion where each throw becomes a meditation, each catch a small victory, the body moving without conscious thought because muscle memory has taken over from deliberate decision-making. The afternoon sun warmed their shoulders. Birds called to each other in the nearby olive trees, their songs carrying across the still air. The world felt safe, predictable, and under control. Then came Apollo's turn to demonstrate an advanced technique he'd been saving for when Hyacinthus had mastered the basics. This particular throw required exceptional timing and strength, sending the discus on an almost impossibly long trajectory. Apollo wanted to show what was possible at the highest levels of skill, to give his students something to aspire toward, a demonstration that excellence always had another level beyond where you currently stood. He planted his feet carefully, checking his stance one final time, began his rotation, feeling the familiar mechanics of the perfect throw engaging, weight shifting smoothly from front foot to back, torso coiling like a spring, arms extending at precisely the right moment. The discus left his hand at exactly the optimal release point, spinning through the air with that satisfying hum that indicates proper rotation and velocity. It was a beautiful throw, one of his better efforts even by divine standards. The kind of throw that would be remembered and discussed by anyone witnessing it, that would become a standard for comparison. Remember when Apollo threw that discus in the field? That's the kind of distance you should be aiming for. The bronze disc flew in a perfect arc against the blue sky, sunlight catching on its spinning surface, making it flash like a small golden bird. But something happened that Apollo, with all his powers of prophecy, didn't foresee. A gust of wind, sudden and powerful, caught the discus mid-flight. Some accounts later said it was sent by Zephyrus, the jealous west wind god who also loved Hyacinthus and resented Apollo's closer relationship with the boy. Other versions claimed it was just terrible luck, random chance, or the universe demonstrating its fundamental indifference to desires and prayers. Whatever the cause, the wind changed the disc's trajectory unpredictably. The bronze disc, heavy and sharp-edged, altered course in mid-air, arcing back toward where Hyacinthus stood, rather than continuing its expected path away from him. Hyacinthus. Thus, running to position himself for what he thought would be the landing zone, he didn't see the trajectory change. He was looking where the discus should have been based on its initial path, not where it actually was after the wind's intervention. His eyes tracked the expected arc, his feet carried him toward the anticipated landing spot, and his hands prepared to catch a throw that was no longer coming in that direction. Everything slowed down in that terrible way moments do when you recognize disaster unfolding but can't prevent it. Apollo shouted a warning, his voice carrying divine power that should have reached Hyacinthus instantly and should have penetrated any distraction. But sound travels slower than bronze, and the distance between them, which had seemed safely far for practice, suddenly became impossibly far for intervention. Apollo reached out as if he could somehow catch the discus from 20 yards away, as if his divine power could reverse time or redirect solid matter already in flight, as if will alone could undo what physics and momentum had already determined. His divine senses tracked the discus's new path with perfect accuracy, saw exactly where it would strike, knew exactly what would happen, and had absolutely no power to prevent any of it. The discus struck Hyacinthus on the forehead with a sound Apollo would hear in his nightmares for centuries afterward. A dull, wet thud that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet afternoon. A sound that contained finality, that marked a boundary between before and after, between whole and broken. The boy crumpled immediately, his strong athlete's body suddenly as limp as an unstrung puppet, muscles that had been so reliably coordinated and controlled failing all at once. He was unconscious before he hit the ground, his mind already shutting down from the catastrophic trauma, his brain attempting to protect itself by turning off awareness. Apollo was there in an instant, his divine speed finally activating now that it was too late to matter. He caught Hyacinthus before the boy fully hit the ground, cradling him with a gentleness that belied his panic, his hands supporting the injured head carefully, even though he already knew with horrible certainty that gentleness couldn't help now. Blood flowed from the wound on Hyacinthus's forehead. So much blood, more than seemed possible from a single injury. It spread across the boy's face, dripped onto Apollo's hands, and stained the grass beneath them with a darkness that seemed to swallow the afternoon's golden light. The smell of it, copper and salt, filled Apollo's awareness. No, 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 Apollo heard himself saying, the word a mantra against the unacceptable reality unfolding before him, as if saying it enough times could reverse what had happened. His voice carried the authority of a god who'd commanded mountains and rivers and plagues. But none of that power meant anything here. Shwee Cindy, thus his eyes opened briefly, unfocused and confused. Pupils different sizes, a sign Apollo knew indicated severe brain trauma. The boy tried to speak, but managed only a weak sound, more breath than word. His hand moved slightly, as if reaching for something, then went still, falling back to his side with terrible finality. Apollo, god of healing, knew exactly what was happening and how little time remained. Head wounds like this were catastrophic, often fatal, even with immediate divine intervention. The human brain, so remarkably complex and sophisticated, was also incredibly fragile. Damage to its structures meant immediate loss of function, and those functions included breathing, heartbeat, and everything that kept the body alive. Blood loss was severe, but that wasn't even the main problem. The impact had caused swelling, crushing delicate tissue against the skull's interior. Structures that controlled basic life functions were being compressed, damaged, and destroyed. The bleeding inside the skull would continue, building pressure, shutting down the brain's ability to signal the heart to beat and the lungs to breathe. He tried anyway, because what else could he do? His hands glowed with divine healing energy as he pressed them against the wound, willing the flesh to knit, the bleeding to stop and the damage to reverse. His power poured into Hyacinthus's body, searching for injuries to repair, breaks to mend, and infections to cure. But there are limits even to divine healing, particularly when the patient is mortal and the injury is this severe. Apollo could heal sickness, cure disease, knit broken bones, close wounds, and fight infections. But he couldn't fundamentally restructure a destroyed brain, couldn't rebuild tissue that had been crushed beyond recognition, and couldn't make dead neurons live again. That would require changing a mortal into something else entirely, transforming their fundamental nature. And such transformations required Olympian approval he didn't have time to seek, even if he'd had hours to beg Zeus for permission, to argue his case before the assembled gods, to accept whatever price they demanded. He didn't have hours. He had minutes at most, maybe less. And travelling to Olympus and back would take too long, even at divine speeds. By the time he returned with permission to transform Hyacinthus into something immortal, the boy would be beyond saving. Shwai-a-sin. Thus his breathing grew shallow, each breath weaker than the last. His chest barely moved with the effort of pulling in air. His heartbeat, which Apollo could hear with his divine senses, stuttered and slowed, struggling to maintain its rhythm against the damage disrupting its signals. The boy's hand, which had fallen to his side, twitched once more in a final reflex, then relaxed with a finality Apollo recognised immediately. "Please," Apollo whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was pleading with. Zeus, the Fates, who spun and measured and cut the threads of mortal lives, the universe itself, vast and indifferent. Please, not this, not him. He was going to matter, going to do something beautiful with his life. Please don't take him now, not like this, not from a stupid accident that meant nothing. But the universe, as Apollo knew better than most, doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about potential or intentions or the prayers of gods. Death comes when it comes, indifferent to who's praying for more time, immune to bargaining or begging. Hyacinthus took one more breath, so shallow it barely moved his chest, and then stopped. His eyes, which had been tracking Apollo's face with fading awareness, became fixed and distant, looking at something beyond the god's ability to see, beyond any ability to follow. The spark that had made him Hyacinthus, thus, curious and kind and full of potential, simply extinguished, leaving behind just a body that had once housed someone remarkable. Apollo sat in the blood-stained grass, holding his friend's body, and felt something he'd never fully experienced before: absolute helplessness. He, who drove the sun across the sky daily, who delivered prophecies that shaped the course of nations, who healed plagues and composed music that could charm stones, couldn't do the one thing that mattered. He couldn't bring back someone who died. All his divine power, accumulated over millennia, refined through endless practice, respected and feared across the Mediterranean, none of it meant anything here. He was as helpless as any mortal watching a loved one die, as powerless as the humans who prayed to him for miracles he couldn't deliver. The afternoon continued around him, indifferent to tragedy. Birds still sang in the olive trees, their songs as cheerful as they'd been moments before. The wind still rustled through grass, making gentle, soothing sounds that mocked the violence it had just participated in. The sun, Apollo's own responsibility, the task he'd been managing for longer than human civilization had existed, continued its arc toward evening, uncaring that the god who usually drove it was paralysed with grief. He lost track of time. Minutes or hours might have passed. Divine perception didn't operate normally when grief overwhelmed it. The sky moved from afternoon gold to evening amber to twilight purple, and still Apollo sat, holding Hyacinthus, unable to process the absolute wrongness of what had happened, unable to accept that the universe could be this arbitrary and cruel. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to Hyacinthus, who'd had so much potential, so much life left to live, so many contributions left to make. Not from such a stupid accident, a gust of wind at the wrong moment, or a discus thrown in play rather than anger. Not while Apollo himself stood watching, powerless to prevent it despite all his divine abilities. The god of prophecy, who could see fragments of the future, replayed the afternoon obsessively in his mind, identifying the exact moment when prevention became impossible. If he'd thrown the discus slightly differently, angled it lower or higher, released it a fraction earlier or later, if they'd practiced somewhere else, in a different field or back at the gymnasium where walls would have blocked the wind, if he'd seen the wind coming, sensed its divine origin, if it really was Zephyrus interfering. If. 1,000 alternate timelines where Hyacinthus didn't die, each one mocking Apollo with its inaccessibility. As full darkness fell and stars emerged, stars Apollo had taught Hyacinthus to name during their evening conversations, pointing out which were planets and which were distant suns. The god finally accepted what he couldn't change. Hyacinthus was gone. No prayer would return him. No divine intervention would undo this death. The fates had cut his thread, and they never rewound what they'd cut. But Apollo, as he sat in the dark holding his friend's cooling body, realised something else. He might not be able to reverse death, but he could do something. He could ensure that Hyacinthus wasn't forgotten, that his beauty and kindness and curiosity didn't just vanish as if they'd never existed. He He could make sure the boy's brief life mattered, that his existence created ripples that would continue forward through time even though he couldn't. It wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough, but it was something. In a universe that offered no second chances, no do-overs, and no reversals of death, creating permanent beauty from temporary tragedy was the best Apollo could manage. Apollo, still holding Hyacinthus's body as darkness completed its conquest of the sky, felt the familiar tingle of divine power stirring within him. Not healing energy this time, which had proven useless, but something different. Transformation magic. The kind of power that had turned Daphne into a laurel tree when she had fled from him, that had changed Callisto into a bear, that had converted dozens of mortals throughout Greek mythology into animals, plants, or constellations. This particular type of magic was ancient and powerful, requiring significant divine energy. It wasn't something gods did casually or frequently, because it reshaped reality at a fundamental level, changing the very essence of what something was. But Apollo had the power, had always had it, and now had the desperate need to use it. He couldn't bring Hyacinthus back to life. That was beyond even his considerable abilities, and would require cooperation from Hades and Persephone, who ruled the underworld, plus approval from Zeus, plus convincing the fates to reweave a thread they'd already cut. The bureaucratic obstacles alone would take weeks, even if everyone agreed immediately, which they wouldn't. And by then any soul would have drunk from the river Lethe and forgotten its mortal life entirely. But he could ensure the boy's essence continued in some form, that some fragment of his existence persisted in the world, that Hyacinthus's name and memory would endure beyond the lifespan of anyone who'd personally known him. Apollo looked at the blood on the grass, dark in the starlight, nearly black except where his own divine radiance made it shimmer slightly. Drops had fallen where Hyacinthus died, staining the earth where they'd spent so many afternoons training and laughing. The soil had drunk the blood eagerly as soil does, absorbing it into itself. The god reached down and touched that blood-soaked earth, and as he did, he poured his grief and love and memories into the ground itself. His power flowed through his hands into the soil, carrying with it everything he felt. The joy of their friendship, the pain of the loss, the desperate wish that things could have been different, and the determination that Hyacinthus would not be forgotten. The transformation began slowly. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with the peculiar speed that divine magic operates at, faster than natural growth but slower than instant materialization, something began emerging from the blood-stained ground. A shoot pushed through the soil, pale green in the darkness, so thin it looked like it might break under its own weight. But it didn't break. Instead, it grew rapidly, extending upward with that reaching quality all new plants have, seeking light even in the middle of the night, responding to some internal imperative that drives growth regardless of circumstance. Apollo watched, barely breathing as the shoot thickened and strengthened. Leaves unfurled, long and slender like blades, catching starlight on their surfaces and holding it so they seemed to glow faintly. The plant rose higher, developing a central stalk that would support flowers, organising itself according to the pattern Apollo's power had encoded into its essence. And then, at the top of the stem, a bud formed. Small at first, barely visible, but swelling rapidly as Apollo's power continued flowing into the transformation. The bud grew fat and tight, containing compressed potential, the promise of beauty waiting to unfold. Apollo continued channeling power into the plant, shaping its nature and determining its characteristics. He wanted it to be beautiful but melancholy, striking but touched with sadness. He wanted anyone who saw it to sense there was a story behind it, that this wasn't just any flower but a memorial, a living monument to loss. The bud swelled larger, its surface showing hints of the colour contained within, deep purple, nearly black in the darkness. Then slowly it began to open. Petals emerged, unfurling like hands opening, revealing their inner surfaces. The flower that bloomed was unlike anything that had existed before. Beautiful in a way that made your chest ache. its colour holding shadows within shadows, darkness that suggested depth rather than emptiness. The petals were velvety, their texture rich and complex. The flower's shape was elegant but not ostentatious, beautiful but not showy, the kind of beauty that revealed itself gradually rather than demanding immediate attention. Its fragrance, which began spreading through the night air, carried a sweetness tinged with something sorrowful, like a melody played in a minor key, but Apollo wasn't finished. The flower alone wasn't enough, not distinctive enough, and not clearly connected enough to Hyacinthus specifically. He needed something more, some way to mark this as specifically commemorating the boy, not just any tragic death. He leaned close to the newly bloomed flower and whispered a blessing into its petals, or perhaps a curse. With divine magic, the line between the two frequently blurs. As he spoke, his breath carrying power and intention, markings appeared on the inner surfaces of the petals. Dark lines formed shapes, patterns that could be read multiple ways depending on who was looking. Some people would later claim these markings spelled out AI, the Greek exclamation of grief, the cry someone makes when confronting unbearable loss. Others insisted the marks formed the letter Upsilon, which was the first letter of Hyacinthus' name in Greek. Still others saw them as abstract patterns, grief made visual without specific linguistic content, and sorrow expressed through form rather than words. What matters is that the markings were there, unmistakable, turning this flower into something more than just a plant. They made it a memorial, a permanent reminder of what had been lost, a way of saying, someone died here, someone who mattered. More shoots emerged from the blood-soaked earth, as Apollo continued pouring power into the transformation. A dozen shoots, then dozens, then hundreds, spreading across the field where Hyacinthus had fallen. The entire area where they'd practiced began transforming into a carpet of purple flowers, all of them carrying those same melancholy markings on their petals, all of them connected to the same source, the boy's blood, Apollo's grief, the moment when a beautiful life ended too soon. Apollo stood, finally releasing Hyacinthus' body. It would need proper handling soon, proper funeral rites as befitted a Spartan youth of good family. But that could wait until morning when he'd have to explain what happened, have to face the boy's father and tell him his son was dead, and have to watch them prepare the body for burial. For now, the god walked through the field of newly created flowers, each bloom a small monument to his friend. The transformation served multiple purposes, as the best divine magic always does. Yes, it memorialized Hyacinthus, ensuring his name would be remembered wherever these flowers grew, which would eventually be throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. But it also gave Apollo's grief somewhere to go, channeling his pain into creation rather than destruction. He could have chosen destruction, could have blasted the field into scorched earth, could have struck down Zephyrus if the wind god really was responsible, could have raged and threatened and made the whole world suffer because he was suffering. Gods had done that before, had made mortals pay for divine grief with plagues and droughts and disasters, but that wouldn't honour Hyacinthus' memory. The boy had been kind, had valued creation over destruction, and had wanted to matter in ways that helped rather than hurt. So Apollo chose to create rather than destroy, to add beauty to the world rather than subtract from it. The transformation also provided a kind of comfort, knowing that every spring when these flowers bloomed, they would carry forward some essence of Hyacinthus. Not his consciousness or personality. The dead don't linger in the plants that grow from their graves, but something nonetheless. A reminder that he'd existed, that he'd been loved, that his brief life had mattered enough to change reality itself. Apollo remained in that field until dawn, watching his sun chariot begin its journey across the sky without him for the first time in ages. He trusted his horses would manage one day on their own. They were well trained and knew the route perfectly. Right now, he needed to stay here with these flowers, with this memorial to his friend. As morning light touched the purple petals, they seemed to glow slightly, catching and holding the sun's rays in a way that made them look internally illuminated. Apollo found himself speaking aloud, knowing Hyacinthus thus couldn't hear, but needing to say the words anyway, needing to articulate the promise he was making. "You wanted to be remembered," he said quietly, his voice rough from crying during the night. "You wanted to matter, to leave something behind that would outlast your brief time alive. You will. Every spring these flowers will bloom. Every garden that plants them will carry your name forward. Every person who stops to admire their beauty will be in some small way honouring you. Your name will become synonymous with this flower. People thousands of years from now will say Hyacinth and be speaking your name without even realising it. It wasn't enough. No memorial would be enough. No flower beautiful enough to compensate for the loss, and no promise adequate to the scale of what had been stolen. But it was something permanent, something that would outlast Apollo's own grief, something that would carry Hyacinthus's name forward into futures neither of them would see. The god of healing, who couldn't heal the one person he most wanted to save, had at least managed this, ensuring that Hyacinthus's death wouldn't be meaningless, that the boy's existence would ripple forward through time in purple petals and sweet fragrance, a memorial that would regenerate itself annually, that would spread and adapt and survive for as long as humans planted gardens and valued beauty. As the sun rose higher and morning brought the necessity of dealing with practical matters, the body, the explanation, the funeral, Apollo touched one of the flowers gently, his finger tracing the dark markings on its petals. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the flower, to Hyacinthus's spirit wherever it had gone, or to the universe that had at least allowed him this much. "Thank you for the time we had. Thank you for teaching me what friendship could be. Thank you for reminding me that brief and meaningful is better than eternal and empty." Then he turned away from the field of flowers and walked back towards Sparta to face the necessary conversations, carrying his grief like a weight that would never fully lift, knowing that a part of him would remain in that field forever, kneeling in blood-soaked grass, holding someone who couldn't be saved, wishing desperately that divine power was enough. As days passed and Apollo's initial shock faded into persistent grief, the kind that doesn't overwhelm every moment but colours every experience, that turns joy slightly grey and makes beauty carry undertones of sadness, he realised the hyacinth flower alone wasn't sufficient. Yes, the flowers would bloom annually, would spread through gardens across the Mediterranean as people cultivated them for their beauty, and would carry Hyacinthus's name forward through generations. But flowers bloom and fade. Their season ends after a few weeks, and then they're gone until next year. Apollo wanted something more permanent, something that would last literally forever, visible every clear night rather than just during spring. Something that couldn't be destroyed by drought or trampling, that didn't depend on humans remembering to plant and tend it. So he looked upward to the stars. The constellations had always fascinated Hyacinthus during their evening conversations. The boy would lie on his back in the grass, arms behind his head, tracing patterns in the night sky with his eyes, asking Apollo to tell him the stories behind each grouping of stars. He'd wanted to know who Orion had been, why Perseus was chasing Andromeda across the heavens, and how the bears had ended up circling the pole star for eternity. Now, Apollo decided to add another story to that celestial collection, to write Hyacinthus's name not just in flowers, but in stars that would shine long after humans forgot what Greece had been, after the gods themselves faded into myth, using power he rarely employed, the kind that required permission from Zeus because reshaping the heavens affected everyone, not just individual mortals. Apollo petitioned his father for the right to create a new constellation. He explained about Hyacinthus, about the friendship and the tragic death, and about his need to memorialize someone who'd mattered to him. Zeus surprisingly agreed without much argument. Perhaps he recognized genuine grief when he saw it, even though he'd never handled his own romantic disasters with anything resembling grace. Or perhaps he simply saw no harm in allowing Apollo this memorial. It wouldn't affect the other constellations, wouldn't interfere with navigation or seasons, and would just be one more story among dozens already written in stars. So Apollo gathered starlight. Actual starlight. energy travelling through the void for years or centuries before reaching Earth, and rearranged it. He reached into the cosmos with divine perception and moved stars, not physically relocating them, but changing how their light arranged itself from Earth's perspective, creating new patterns in the ancient darkness. The exact shape of the constellation varied depending on who was telling the story later. Some said it looked like a youth with a discus, immortalising the moment before tragedy struck. Others claimed it resembled the hyacinth flower itself, petals spreading across the night sky. Still others saw it as an abstract pattern, beautiful but indefinable, which seemed appropriate for memorialising someone whose greatest quality had been hard to put into words. The specifics mattered less than the permanence. Unlike the flowers that bloomed and faded, subject to weather and seasons and human cultivation, these stars would shine for millennia. They'd outlast civilizations, and they would still be visible when the Greek language was dead, and Apollo himself was reduced to stories told around campfires. As long as the universe existed, these stars would mark where Hyacinthus had been, what he'd meant, and how much his brief life had mattered. But Apollo's grief did something else too, something less intentional and more a side effect of divine emotion, affecting the natural world in ways the god didn't fully control. The flowers he'd created from Hyacinthus's blood didn't just bloom randomly throughout the year. Instead, they became tied to the seasons themselves, emerging specifically in early spring like a yearly resurrection, a promise that winter always ended and beauty always returned. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. Greek mythology is full of stories where divine emotion shapes natural cycles. Demeter's grief over losing Persephone creating winter, Helios's anger at Phaethon's recklessness scorching parts of the earth, and Poseidon's moods generating storms that destroyed shipping. Apollo's loss similarly imprinted itself on nature's calendar, his grief becoming part of the world's annual rhythm. Every spring, as winter's grip released and warmth returned to the Mediterranean, hyacinth flowers would emerge from the earth. They'd push through soil that had been frozen or merely cold, would unfurl leaves and produce buds, and would bloom in those characteristic deep purple shades, their markings visible to anyone who looked closely. Their blooming became a kind of annual promise. Beauty could return after darkness, colour could emerge from dormancy, and life could push through soil towards sunlight. Loss, while permanent, didn't have to be the final word. Greek communities began incorporating this natural cycle into their cultural observances. A festival developed in Sparta specifically, honouring Hyacinthus's memory, with athletic competitions, discus throwing, naturally, but also running, wrestling, and music contests. These weren't sombre, mourning ceremonies full of black clothing and tears, but celebrations of the qualities Hyacinthus thus had embodied: athletic excellence, curiosity, kindness, joy in learning, and competition. The festival, called the Hyacinthia, lasted 3 days and became one of Sparta's most important annual events. The first day involved mourning and remembrance, acknowledging the tragedy of the boy's death. But the second and third days were celebratory, with contests and feasting and music, honouring the life rather than dwelling exclusively on the death. It was exactly the kind of memorial Chief Hyacinthus would have wanted. Not morose, but life-affirming. Not focused on the end, but on everything that came before it. Apollo would sometimes attend these festivals in disguise, appearing as an ordinary visitor from another city rather than revealing his divine nature. He'd watch mortals compete in the discus throw, critiquing their form silently, noting how techniques had evolved over the years. He'd listen to musicians perform, hear poets recite verses about Hyacinthus and Apollo's friendship, and observe how the story was told and retold with small variations. These visits provided cold comfort. Nothing could truly compensate for Hyacinthus's absence. No festival could fill the hole his death had created. But they helped nonetheless. Knowing that others remembered, that the boy's name hadn't vanished into history's anonymous masses, that his story continued being told. All of it gave Apollo's grief some structure, some meaning beyond pure loss. The god also changed his own behaviour in subtle ways that persisted across centuries. He became a patron to young athletes, offering particular favour to those who showed promise in track and field events, especially discus throwing. When prayers reached him from competitors asking for victory, he'd pay special attention to those whose technique reminded him of Hyacinthus, whose dedication to improvement matched what he'd seen in his friend. He encouraged poetry and music that emphasised beauty and friendship rather than warfare and conquest. When he judged competitions or inspired artists, he favoured works that celebrated life's gentler aspects over those glorifying violence. He promoted healing and medicine with renewed dedication, as if he could retroactively save Hyacinthus by saving thousands of others, as if each healed patient somehow balanced the scale of the one he'd failed to save. He was gentler with mortals generally, more patient with their flaws and limitations, having learned through devastating experience how fragile their lives were. Before Hyacinthus's death, Apollo had sometimes been impatient with mortal foolishness, quick to punish mistakes, and harsh with those who failed to properly honour him. Afterward he found himself more forgiving, more willing to overlook minor offences, and more aware that mortal lives were already hard enough without divine retribution making them harder. Some of Apollo's fellow gods noticed these changes. Artemis, his twin sister, cornered him one evening on Olympus after a particularly quiet day, where Apollo had barely spoken to anyone, and had just gone through his duties mechanically before retreating to his own quarters. "What happened?" she asked directly, because Artemis didn't believe in approaching difficult topics carefully. She preferred directness and appreciated honesty, even when it was painful. Apollo told her about Hyacinthus, about the friendship that had developed over months of training and conversation, about the terrible accident that couldn't have been prevented, about the flower and the stars and the grief that wouldn't fade no matter how much time passed. Artemis listened without interruption. One of her better qualities was knowing when to stay silent, when someone needed to talk without being questioned or advised. She understood loss herself, had lost companions over the centuries, and knew how a single death could create a hole that never fully closed, and how you learned to live around the absence but never truly got over it. When Apollo finished speaking, Artemis was quiet for a moment, then said simply, "I'm sorry." 2 words, but they helped. Apollo had worried his siblings would mock his grief over a mortal, would see it as weakness or eccentricity, and would make jokes about him being overly sentimental. But Artemis understood. She didn't diminish his pain by comparing it to anything else, and didn't try to fix it or offer hollow comfort. She just acknowledged it, which was exactly what he needed. As years turned to decades and decades to centuries, the hyacinth spread throughout the Mediterranean region and beyond. Gardeners cultivated it, selecting for different colours and larger blooms, creating varieties that barely resembled the original wild plant Apollo had created. Poets wrote about it, associating its purple petals with remembrance and grief. Artists painted it, incorporating it into everything from funeral urns to wedding frescoes, a flower comfortable with both joy and sorrow, appropriate for beginnings and endings alike. The constellation Apollo created became part of the mythology that generations of Greek children learned. One more story among dozens explaining why the night sky looked the way it did. Sailors used it for navigation during certain seasons. Poets referenced it in verses about lost love and mourning. Philosophers used it as an example when discussing questions of immortality and memory. Did eternal remembrance constitute a form of immortality, or was it merely consolation for the living who couldn't bear to forget? And Apollo himself, while he never stopped missing Hyacinthus, found his grief slowly transforming into something more bearable. The acute pain, the kind that made him wake up forgetting his friend was dead, then remembering and feeling the loss all over again, gradually faded into a chronic ache. That ache eventually settled into melancholy acceptance, the kind of sadness that becomes part of who you are rather than something you're actively suffering through. He could think about Hyacinthus without feeling like his chest was being crushed. He could tell stories about their time together without his voice breaking. He He could see young athletes training and feel pleasure in their potential, rather than only sadness that Hyacinthus never got to fulfill his own. The memories became less painful and more precious, something to be treasured rather than avoided. The hyacinth's annual blooming became Apollo's personal calendar, a way of marking time passing. Each spring when the flowers emerged, he'd take a day away from his divine duties to visit Sparta, to stand in fields of purple blooms and remember. Sometimes he'd bring his lyre and play, composing melodies that carried both sadness and gratitude. Sometimes he'd simply stand in silence, letting the flower's fragrance trigger memories, allowing himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost. This yearly ritual provided structure to his grieving, a designated time and place for active mourning rather than constant overwhelming sorrow. It allowed him to box his loss into manageable portions, 1 day per year of full remembrance, the rest of the year carrying the loss more quietly, more privately, integrated into who he was rather than consuming all his attention. The Greeks, observant about their gods' behaviours even when those gods tried to hide their feelings, incorporated this pattern into their own grieving practices. They learned to allocate specific times for mourning, festivals, anniversaries, designated days for visiting graves, rather than expecting grief to be either constant and overwhelming or completely absent. Apollo's handling of Hyacinthus's death became a template for how mortals might survive losing someone they loved. Acknowledge the loss, create memorials, establish rituals for remembrance, but also continue living. As centuries rolled past and ancient Greece transformed into distant history, its cities conquered, its language evolving beyond recognition, its gods relegated to the status of myths rather than active deities, the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus persisted. It survived the fall of Greek civilization, was adopted by the Romans who called the god Phoebus, but kept the flower's name, travelled through the medieval period in manuscripts copied by monks who found the story's themes of loss and transformation resonant even within Christian contexts, and emerged into the modern era as one of classical mythology's more enduring tales. But stories change as they're retold, shaped by each culture's values and concerns and each generation's particular anxieties and preoccupations. The relationship between Apollo and Hyacinthus was variously interpreted as friendship, mentorship, romantic love, or divine patronage depending on who was telling the story and what they needed it to mean. Some versions emphasize the athletic training, presenting the tale as primarily about sports and competition. Others focused on the emotional bond, exploring what it meant for a god to love a mortal. Still others concentrated on the tragic accident itself, using it to explore themes of fate and mortality and divine limitations. The tale's flexibility, its ability to be read multiple ways without any single interpretation being obviously wrong, helped ensure its survival. Stories that can only mean one thing tend to die when cultures change, and that particular meaning becomes irrelevant. But flexible stories adapt, finding new significance for new audiences, remaining alive by transforming to meet each generation's needs. Artists throughout history found themselves drawn to the story's emotional core. Ancient Greek pottery showed Hyacinthus and Apollo together, discus in hand, captured in that moment before tragedy, when everything still seemed safe and predictable. Black figure and red figure vases depicted the youth's beauty, the god's grace, and the athletic equipment that would become instruments of death. Renaissance painters depicted the death scene with dramatic flair, with Apollo cradling the dying youth while the fatal discus lay nearby, blood dramatically visible, and grief theatrically rendered. These paintings emphasized the tragedy, the moment of loss, and the god's helplessness in the face of mortality. They were exercises in pathos, designed to evoke tears from viewers who recognized in Apollo's situation their own experiences of losing people they couldn't save. Romantic-era poets wrote lengthy verses exploring the grief and transformation, finding in Apollo's actions a model for how art could emerge from loss and how beauty could be created from pain. They saw the flower as representing poetry itself, something beautiful grown from suffering, the transformation of negative emotions into positive creations. Modern writers continued reimagining the tale, finding new angles and emphases. Some focused on the relationship's homoerotic aspects, reclaiming the story as part of LGBTQ+ history. Others explored themes of divine responsibility and the ethics of gods involving themselves with mortals. Still others used it to examine broader questions about memory and legacy, about what it means to be remembered, and whether that constitutes a form of immortality. The hyacinth flower itself became deeply embedded in European and Mediterranean gardens. Horticulturalists bred new varieties in dozens of colours: white, pink, yellow, blue, even true red, though the original deep purple remained most popular for those who knew the story. The flower's strong fragrance made it a favourite for perfumes and potpourris, its scent becoming instantly recognisable, triggering associations with spring and renewal. Its association with spring made it a natural symbol of resurrection and regeneration, particularly in Christian contexts that borrowed and repurposed classical imagery. Easter celebrations often featured hyacinths, the flower's emergence from seemingly dead bulbs paralleling resurrection narratives, their timing coinciding conveniently with the holiday. Interestingly, the flower modern gardeners call hyacinth isn't technically the same plant ancient Greeks would have associated with Hyacinthus. The original flower was likely either a type of iris or a martagon lily, both of which grow wild in Greece and have markings on their petals that could be interpreted as letters or symbols. The modern hyacinth, scientifically Hyacinthus orientalis, is native to the eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor, and was matched with the myth later, its beauty and springtime blooming making it a natural fit for the story, even if it wasn't the original plant Apollo created. But this botanical confusion doesn't diminish the myth's impact. The story's emotional truth transcends specific species of flowers. What matters is the core narrative, how love and loss can create something lasting, how beauty can emerge from tragedy, and how remembrance serves as a kind of immortality, even if it's not the same as having the person alive. Psychologists and philosophers have explored the myth's deeper meanings, finding in it insights about human nature and the grief process. Some see it as representing the inevitable loss of innocence, the transition from youth to adulthood marked by death's first real intrusion into consciousness. That moment when you realise mortality isn't just an abstract concept, but something that can strike without warning, taking people you care about, leaving you helpless and changed. Others interpret it as examining the price of divine interaction with mortals, how the gap between immortal and mortal perspectives creates tragic misunderstandings and dangerous situations. Gods don't fully grasp mortality's urgency, don't understand fragility the way mortals do, and that incomprehension can have fatal consequences. Still others focus on the creative response to loss, analysing how grief can be channeled into art, memory and meaning rather than destructive rage or despair. Apollo's choice to create the flower rather than, say, destroying Sparta in revenge or punishing Zephyrus if he was actually responsible, represents a particular kind of maturity. The recognition that adding suffering to suffering solves nothing, that the only constructive response to loss is creation. The myth also raises questions about the nature of immortality itself. Hyacinthus gained a kind of eternal life through transformation, his name and memory preserved forever in flower and constellation. But is this true immortality, or merely a consolation prize, a second best option when actual resurrection proved impossible? Apollo certainly doesn't think it's equivalent to having his friend alive and whole, yet it's something, which makes it valuable in a universe where death usually means complete erasure. Religious scholars have noted parallels between Hyacinthus's death and resurrection, and later Christian themes of dying and rising gods. Spring festivals celebrating Hyacinthus influenced later Easter traditions, the timing and symbolism overlapping in ways that blur together when viewed from 2,000 years distance. The hyacinth's emergence from the earth mirrors resurrection narratives across multiple faiths, suggesting deep human needs to find hope in loss, continuity in change, and meaning in death. The constellation Apollo created has largely faded from astronomical maps, either lost to time or subsumed into other stellar patterns recognised by different cultures. Modern astronomers don't officially recognise a Hyacinthus constellation. The International Astronomical Union, which standardised constellation names in 1922, didn't include it in their official list. But this disappearance doesn't entirely erase Apollo's celestial memorial. It simply means we've forgotten where to look, which stars Apollo rearranged in honour of his friend. The stars are still there, still shining, still arranged however the god placed them. We just no longer tell their story, no longer see the pattern he created. In a way, that's appropriate. Even the most permanent memorials eventually fade from memory, which is why the annually regenerating flower has proven more lasting than the eternal stars. What endures most strongly is the emotional resonance of the myth itself. Across cultures and centuries, people recognise the particular grief Apollo experienced, the helplessness of watching someone die from an accident, the guilt of feeling responsible even when rationally you know you aren't, the desperate wish to undo what's already happened, the rage at unfairness and randomness, and the eventual acceptance that some things can't be changed. These emotions transcend the specifics of discus throwing and ancient Greek athletics. They speak to universal human experiences of loss, car accidents that happen in split seconds, terminal diagnoses that come without warning, and violence that steals people in their prime. Every generation has its own versions of Hyacinthus, people who died before their potential was realised, whose deaths felt especially unfair because they had so much left to give. The myth also captures something important about friendship itself, particularly friendships that cross typical boundaries. Apollo and Hyacinthus bridge the gap between mortal and divine, young and experienced, and student and teacher. Their connection wasn't based on equality of power or status. They were fundamentally unequal in almost every measurable way. But it was based on genuine mutual regard, on each enriching the other's existence in ways that wouldn't have happened without their meeting. Modern readers sometimes struggle with the myth's ending, wanting Apollo to find some way to save Hyacinthus, wanting divine power to be enough. Stories today often provide miraculous reversals, last-second rescues, and ways around seemingly inevitable deaths. But the myth's power lies partly in its refusal to offer that consolation. Death is permanent. Lost opportunities don't get second chances. The only response available is to create meaning from loss, to ensure memory persists even when the person doesn't. In gardens across the world today, hyacinths still bloom every spring. Most people planting them don't know the full mythological story behind the flower's name, don't realise they're participating in a memorial that's thousands of years old, and don't connect the purple petals to a Spartan youth who died in a training accident. They simply enjoy the flower's beauty, their fragrance, and their reliable return after winter's darkness. And maybe that's the most fitting legacy. Hyacinthus wanted to matter, wanted to be remembered, and wanted to leave some mark on the world beyond military glory. Through Apollo's transformation, he achieved that in the most distributed way possible, not through grand monuments that eventually crumble, not through epic poems that eventually cease being read, but through living beauty that regenerates itself, that adapts and spreads, that brings small moments of joy to millions of people who will never know his name. The flowers bloom purple in springtime, carrying Apollo's grief and love forward through centuries, and that quiet persistence might be more meaningful than any dramatic memorial could be. Every garden that plants them continues the story. Every person who pauses to smell their fragrance participates unknowingly in ancient grief transformed into annual beauty. Hyacinthus thus exists now as a principle rather than a person. The idea that loss can become creation, that grief can generate beauty, and that the people we love continue through what they inspired in us rather than through their physical presence. It's cold comfort when you're first experiencing loss, when all you want is the person back and memorials feel like inadequate substitutes. But over time, over centuries, it's the only kind of immortality that actually works, the only way to carry forward people who are gone. Your breathing has slowed now, deepened into the rhythm of approaching sleep. The story of Apollo and Hyacinthus has carried you through the evening, through your own day's concerns and worries, into this quieter mental space where consciousness begins to blur and drift, where thoughts become less linear and more dreamlike. Perhaps the myth resonates because we all carry losses, and all wish we could transform our grief into something beautiful and permanent the way Apollo did. Perhaps it comforts us to know that even gods feel helpless sometimes, that divine power doesn't insulate anyone from the pain of losing someone they care about, and that grief is universal regardless of whether you're mortal or immortal. Or perhaps you're simply tired, ready for sleep, and the story has served its purpose as a gentle distraction from whatever kept your mind active earlier, whatever worries or anxieties were circling like persistent flies. That's perfectly fine too. Not every story needs deep meaning or profound insight. Sometimes a tale is just pleasant company on the journey toward unconsciousness, something to occupy your attention while your body relaxes and your mind winds down. The hyacinths will bloom again next spring, regardless of whether you remember this story in the morning, regardless of whether the myth means anything to you personally. The stars Apollo rearranged will continue their slow wheel across the night sky, visible to anyone who looks up on clear evenings. And somewhere, in whatever space gods occupy in our modern world, if they exist at all anymore beyond the stories we tell about them, Apollo continues his eternal duties, carrying his ancient grief with the kind of grace that only millennia of practice can provide. Your muscles are heavy now, your mind drifting like smoke on a breeze. The words are becoming less distinct, merging into general sound, into rhythm, into the white noise that carries you away from wakefulness toward whatever dreams await you tonight. Tomorrow will come soon enough, bringing its own concerns and tasks and urgencies. The alarm will ring or the light will wake you, and you'll return to your regular life with its responsibilities and relationships and complications. But tonight, you've had this, a story about friendship and loss, about creating beauty from tragedy, about how we carry forward the people we've loved even after they're gone. The hyacinth blooms purple in springtime, marked with patterns that might be letters or might be nothing, depending on how you look at them. And that's all you need to remember. That beauty returns after winter, that grief can transform into something generative, that the people who matter to us continue in what they taught us, in how they changed us, and in the memories we carry. Everything else can wait until morning. Sleep well,